Act 1. Cold Open. He stepped ashore expecting his daughter. What he found instead was a word. It was carved into a wooden post at the height of a man's chest, deep enough that lichen had begun to fill the grooves. 8 letters. No body to bury, no fire on the beach, no voice to answer the one he had been carrying with him across an ocean for 3 years. He had left 115 people on this island. He had left his daughter. He had left a granddaughter he had held only once. He had been gone too long. Act 2. The Record. The colony at Roanoke was the second English attempt at this island, off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. The first attempt, a small military garrison, had collapsed in 1586. The second was meant to be different. The second was meant to be permanent. In July of 1587, a fleet of 3 ships put 115 colonists ashore, men, women, and children. Their governor was John White, a painter and a cartographer, a man more accustomed to a brush than to a sword. His daughter Eleanor was among the colonists. Her husband Ananias Dare was with her. She was pregnant. They had been promised the deep harbor of the Chesapeake. The pilot of their fleet, for reasons that were never fully recorded, refused to carry them further north. He set them at Roanoke and sailed on. On the 18th of August, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia. She was the first English child born in the Americas whose birth was set down on paper. 9 days later, John White sailed back for England. The colony was thin on supplies. He intended to be gone a few months. He did not see his family again. Act 3. The Anomaly. A war intervened. England was already at the edge of its long fight with Spain, and within a year of his return, every seaworthy English vessel had been ordered against the Armada. White petitioned. He pleaded. He signed on to a small private voyage that was driven back by privateers and weather. 3 years passed before he could turn his bow back toward Roanoke. He reached the island on the 17th of August, 1590. It was his granddaughter's 3rd birthday. There were no fires. There should have been fires. He came ashore at dusk and found the palisade still standing. The houses inside were gone. Not burned, not torn down by storm. They had been carefully dismantled, the timbers removed, as if their owners had wanted to take them somewhere else. There was no smoke in the chimneys because there were no chimneys. There were no graves. There was no battle wreckage. There were no bones. There was a carving. On one of the palisade posts, at chest height, someone had cut the word Croatan. On a tree nearby, 3 letters, C-R-O. No 4th letter started, as if whoever was doing the carving had been called away. This is the part of the story that the historical record will not stop pulling at. Before he sailed, White had agreed with the colonists when a signal. If they were forced to leave, they were to carve the name of their destination plainly into a tree or a post. If they were leaving under attack, under threat, under any kind of fear, they were to add a Maltese cross above the name, a small 4-pointed mark. Easy to cut, impossible to mistake. There was no cross.
The settlement had not been raided. The settlement had not been overrun. Whoever had left this beach had left it on purpose, in order, with the houses pulled down for transport, and they had taken the time to tell John White exactly where they had gone. Croatoan was an island. It was also the name of a people. It lay about 50 miles to the south. The Croatoan tribe, led at that time by a man named Montijo, had been the colony's only consistent ally. Montijo himself had crossed to England with an earlier expedition. He had stood in the court of Queen Elizabeth. He had returned willingly. If the colonists had walked anywhere, they had walked toward friends. White walked the inside of the palisade by torchlight. He recorded what he saw in a careful hand. The chests he had buried before he sailed had been dug up and broken open. His own armor lay rusted in the grass. His maps and books, the ones he had not been able to take to England, had been thrown across the ground and left to the rain. Whatever the colonists had taken with them when they left, it had not included these. They had taken what they could carry. They had left behind what only their governor would mourn. There were 5 iron pieces of small ordnance scattered in the grass. There were no weapons stacked against attack. There were no graves. 115 people had walked off this island carrying their houses on their backs. Act 4. The Investigation. White did not reach Croatoan. A storm came in from the south that night. The cables of his ship parted in heavy seas. Anchors were lost. The captain, a man with a contract to keep and a hurricane to outrun, made the decision that ended John White's search forever. They turned the ship east. They sailed for the Caribbean. They sailed for home. White wrote about it later. He wrote that the wind carried him away from his family. He wrote it the way a man writes about a loss he cannot quite admit yet. He never returned to North America. Other ships did. Sir Walter Raleigh sent at least one expedition during White's lifetime. In the early 17th century, when Jamestown was founded 100 miles to the north, settlers there made several attempts to find the lost colony. They sent inland scouts. They asked Powhatan tribes about gray-eyed people who had walked west. They heard rumors. They never produced a survivor. They never produced a body. They never produced a name. For 400 years after that, the file stayed open. In the 17th century, traders working out of Jamestown collected accounts from coastal tribes that spoke of villages, deeper inland, where the children had gray eyes and lighter hair, and where the elders kept iron tools they had been given by people they no longer remembered. The accounts were never written down by the people who had them. They were written down by the people who heard them, and then by the people who heard the people who heard them. By the time they appeared in print in the 18th century, they had passed through enough hands to be no longer evidence.
In 1937, a man walked into Emory University with a stone he claimed to have found in a swamp in North Carolina. The stone was carved with what appeared to be a message from Eleanor Dare to her father. Within a few years, more than 40 stones surfaced. They became famous as the Dare stones. They were studied, they were doubted. Most modern historians treat all but the first as forgeries, and the first one is at best unresolved. In 2003, scientists studying the rings of bald cypress trees on the North Carolina coast found something quieter and harder to dismiss. The years 1587 through 1589 had been the worst drought that region had endured in the previous 800 years. 3 years of failed harvests, 3 years of dying creeks, 3 years that fell directly on top of 115 English colonists who had not been resupplied. Act 5. The Silence. This is where the trail ends. We know they ran out of food. We know the people closest to them, the Croatoan, were running out of food too. We know the colony left in order, dismantled the houses for portability, and pointed John White toward an island 50 miles away. We do not know if they reached it. We do not know if some of them reached it and some of them died along the way. We do not know if a smaller, weaker group split off and walked inland to other tribes. We do not know if any of them survived the 3rd year of the drought. We do not know if any of them lived long enough to see Jamestown founded 20 years later, less than a week's walk from where their bones might lie. We know that for a long time, the descendants of coastal Carolina tribes told stories about ancestors with gray eyes and English names. We know those stories were collected by amateur historians and discounted by professionals, and collected again by their grandchildren. We know nothing in those stories rises to the standard of evidence that closes a case. The case has not been closed. The drought is the closest thing to an answer the record has produced. It explains why a colony with food running thin would dismantle its houses and walk south to its allies. It does not explain why no one ever came back. It does not explain why no English document of the next 30 years contains the name of a single Roanoke survivor. It does not explain why John White, who lived another 3 years and possibly more, never received a letter from his daughter. The drought explains the leaving. It does not explain the silence. In the early 21st century, archaeologists working 2 sites on the North Carolina coast, one near the village of Hatteras, one further west on the mainland, recovered small European artifacts in indigenous contexts that date to the right window of years: a signet ring, a piece of slate writing tablet, a few iron tool fragments. None of these objects names a person. None of them closes the file. They suggest only that some material from the colony reached indigenous hands, by trade or by gift, or by the slower process of a small group of survivors carrying what they had into a new life. That is the most that careful archaeology has been able to say. Act 6. The Archivist's Close. John White died in Ireland, probably in 1593, on the estate of his patron. He was an old man by then, by the standards of his age. He had not seen his granddaughter since she was 9 days old. He had not seen his daughter since the morning he sailed for supplies. The last word he had from either of them was a name carved into a wooden post by hands he had taught to write. He never knew. That is the heaviest part of this file, not the colony, the grandfather. If the unfinished histories haunt you the way they haunt me, there is another file on the desk. The lamp is still lit.